Welcome to today's webinar entitled FSMA Final Ruling. We're excited that you have joined us. My name is Karen Whitman and I am the moderator today. We have a few housekeeping items before we get started with the presentation. Today's webinar is recorded and will be available to everyone 1 to 2 days after the webinar. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation portion. Any questions in the queue that are not answered during the presentation, Gary will follow up with after the webinar. When questions do arise, go ahead and enter them into the queue by clicking on the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel and simply typing your question in. And it is now my pleasure to introduce to you Gary Smith. With a Master's in Science, Environmental Biology from Governor State University and a Bachelor's of Science in Animal Science from the University of Illinois, Gary brings over 20 years of industry experience to his duties at Eurofins Food Safety Systems. He helps with food processors, distributors, and packagers of all sizes navigate the complexities of achieving compliance with the latest food standards, creating value beyond certification. In addition, he oversees all aspects of the supply chain business, including vendors, GMP, GLP, and warehouse and distribution auditing services and certifications, and all SQF, FSMA, QS, and international safe feed and food, and domestic safe food work. Gary has worked on as a regulator, buyer, supplier, trainer, auditor, head of a certification body, and a head of a standard owner. With industry experience in produce, meat, bakeries, dairy, warehouse, distribution, packaging, beverage, and confectionery, this broad perspective means Gary is uniquely equipped to help organizations determine which standards offer the best benefits to their business and their most practical strategies for complying with them. A leader in food safety and service. Gary has an extensive list of professional certifications and industry memberships and has been active on a number of policy influencing committees. He currently serves as chair of the Food Safety Service Providers, a member of the Acceleration Task Force and Guidance Document Working Group, a member of the GFSI, and as a member of the Technical Advisory Committee for SQFI. Previous committee work includes a Council 3 membership with the Conference for Food Protection. Other key recognition, certifications, and industry memberships include the inaugural SQF Institute Distinguished Service Award, which recognizes Gary's lifelong commitment to promoting and strengthening food safety and certification programs worldwide. Certified Quality Auditor for HACCP under the American Society of Quality. Certified HACCP Instructor with the International HACCP Alliance and National Seafood Alliance. Registered Sanitarian and Food Safety Auditor. Credentialing subject matter expert with the National Environmental Health Association in the state of Missouri. Certified auditor for AWAP Animal Welfare Program for the Food Marketing Institute and NCCR Audit Program. Member International Association of the Food Protection and a member of the National Environmental Health Association. Prior to joining Eurofins, Gary served as the Director of Training, Improvement Solutions, and Food Safety at SAI, Global Vice President of Supply Chain Consulting at Ceratec, and Technical Director for the Safety Quality Food Institute, SQFI. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today's presenter, Gary Smith. Take it away, Gary.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Thank you for that. And good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you're at in the country. I'm happy to talk to you today a little bit about the Food Safety Modernization Act, the Human and Animal Food Final Rule, which has finally been published in September of this year. So just a little bit of background about the Food Safety Modernization Act. It was a piece of legislation that was passed by Congress in 2010. signed into law by the President in January of 2011. And as we may remember, there is legislation differences versus rule differences. So what the legislation that Congress passed basically said was that FDA needed to create rules to achieve the goals of the legislation and have those out initially by July of 2013. Now, as we all know, those deadlines were not quite met, and we had some going back and forth with FDA. They did issue some drafts, which we were able to comment on, and again, an unprecedented amount of back and forth between industry and FDA, which was a good thing to get the final rule in its final state, which we now have seen. Again, September 10th, 2015, the issuance of the final rule. There's actually two rules, the human food and animal food final rule, which we'll talk about today. The human food rule, 930 pages of information. Now, the rule isn't 930 pages. The rule is about the last 100 of it or so. The first 800 or so pages talks about many of the comments that FDA received and some of their responses. The good thing about that, we refer to that as the preamble. The good thing about that is that you can read, if you're so inclined to want to read that, you can get a feeling for guidance on how FDA is going to interpret things, how they're going to talk to their inspectors about how to, interpret things. So there is some valuable information in that first part of the publication. Hopefully I'll be able to give you some of the insights to that so you don't have to read it yourself. But you're certainly inclined to do that. I'll mention also at the end of this webinar, we're going to have white papers available by the end of this week that we'll be sending out to all registrants on the webinar that describe both the human food and animal food final rule with, again, guidance for implementation of the rules. Other sections of the rule, and what we have to remember is that for the Food Safety Modernization Act, the human food and animal food rules are just 2 of 7 pieces of it. The rest of those final rules are set to be published over the next 6 months, so the final remainder of the Food Safety Modernization Act. So actually there's 7 rules that are going to be written, and we'll look at those in just a minute, that make up the Food Safety Modernization Act. So again, just a step back to think about what was the goal for FDA, what was the intent. To prevent food safety problems. So to design a system to be proactive rather than reactive, to try to get out in front of food safety issues, detect and respond to food safety problems, to improve our capacity and ability to do that, and of course deal with our imports as well. We know that through imports as well as products supplied to us from overseas, many of our outbreaks have occurred from that as well. So the rule has a Food Safety Modernization Act has a component on foreign supplier verification program as well. So here are the foundational rules for FSMA. And again, as I mentioned, there are 7 total. We're only going to be talking about the first 2 today because those are the rules that we have seen as final. Again, current good manufacturing practices and hazard analysis of risk-based preventive controls for human food as well as for animal food. So those 2 separate rules. In addition, we know the other aspects of FSMA include the Produce Food Safety Rule, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, the accreditation of third-party certification bodies, food defense or mitigation strategies to protect against intentional adulteration, and safe sanitary transportation of food. So those are all in draft, and we'll show you at the end of the webinar what the timing is for when to expect those other rules to come out. So this is not the end-all be-all for FSMA. This is really just the beginning. Certainly 2 very important pieces of it, but it is not the end. There will be additional rules that come out from FSMA within the next 6 months. And again, this is really the most significant change to food industry legislation in the United States basically since 1938. So it's been a long time in coming, and it's certainly going to have an impact on the food industry in the U.S. and globally, really, over the next few years. So some of the sections of FSMA that we're not going to talk about today include FDA's now ability to have a mandatory recall. which they do, and they have that ability now. Detention services at the border, registration of facilities. We'll talk a little bit about registration, but we're not going to really get into the requirements. That's already been in place for quite a while. The voluntary qualified importer program fees that now FDA can charge for inspections, and the whole exemptions to qualified individuals and how their facilities and withdrawals of exemptions for qualified facilities. We're not going to talk much about that. There is quite a bit of sections of that in the final rule. If you're interested in it, there are definitely ways to learn about that, but we're not going to cover it today. So let's talk about who is covered by the Preventive Control Food Final Rule. All facilities who are required to register with the FDA under Section 415 who are not exempted. So basically, the reason that in 2002 FDA first issued the bioterrorism requirement for registration, now FDA is utilizing that information to require those folks who have registered to be under this rule. Now, looking at the rule, FDA estimates there's about 48,000 facilities who have registered in the U.S. who are going to be required to be under this rule. So that's all human and animal food, manufacturing, processing, packing, holding facilities, included, as well as storage and distribution centers who have both exposed product as well as unexposed product. All of those folks will be covered. Let's talk about who's not covered. Retail food establishments, so grocery stores, restaurants, convenience stores, they are covered under the food code, and that authority lies with the local public health authorities. So that's their jurisdiction, and this rule does not cover any of those facilities who are serving food directly to the public. Protein manufacturers, beef, pork, poultry, production facilities covered by USDA, they are not covered by this final rule. And farms. Farms are going to be covered under the produce safety rule, which will be coming out in the end of October. They are not also covered by this rule. So primary production, secondary activities, as well as feed mills of vertically integrated facilities are not covered by this rule, but they will be covered by the produce safety rule. And again, we'll be seeing that at the end of October. So let's talk a little bit about what the rules look like. There's basically the way it lays out. On the human food side, for the good manufacturing practices, or GMPs, we were very used to referring to 21 CFR Part 110. 110 is currently where the GMPs for human food exist. Those are now transitioning, and 110 is now going to be removed, and 110 is transitioned over to 117. As you see there, we've got components of the new rule. The current good manufacturing practices, Part B, which we'll talk a little bit about. In the content-wise, not too much difference, really just the addition of allergen controls in the human food, and prevention of cross-contact is really the biggest updates to that. The big change, obviously, is Part C, where we have hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. That is all new, and that is going to be a significant update for the food industry. And then, of course, Part F is an important part as well, in which records must be maintained and established. So, FDA has limited access to a facilities' production, quality, food safety, manufacturing records that they have today, and we'll go through it, what exactly the jurisdiction, the agency will have the capacity to review going forward. So those are the components. On the animal food side, very similar. Now, one of the things that we have to mention, and some of you in the animal food industry certainly are aware of that, the animal food industry has not had good manufacturing practices yet. This is new. So this is a whole new component. These GMPs, you'll see that there are some subtle differences between the human food side and the animal food side, but many of the sections and structures are the same. But the content is different enough that it's certainly worth reviewing it and understanding how it's changed. And again, this is a whole new aspect for this industry, so there certainly will be some need for awareness and education on it. Of course, the animal food also has the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls section to it as well. So two big changes really, animal food industry. A, the introduction of GMPs, and B, the addition of the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. So certainly the animal food industry is going to be affected by these going forward. And then, of course, you see in subpart F, you see the requirements of records there as well. So we'll review those as we go through. So just to look at the GMPs for human food, again, Part 117, Part B of the rule. And if you're familiar with 110, you'll see that the sections are pretty similar, as I said. Personnel addresses disease control, cleanliness, hand washing, jewelry, hairnets, etc. Plants and grounds, you know, the exterior of the facility, the design of the facility, construction, sanitary operations, the maintenance, storage of chemicals, pest control, sanitation of the facility, food contact as well as non-food contact surfaces, sanitary design and control of the facility, water supply, plumbing, sewage, toilet, hand washing, etc., equipment and utensils, processes and controls, warehouse distribution, and defect action levels. So those are the GMPs for human food. And again, if you're familiar with what they were with 110, content-wise, they really haven't changed a whole lot. Again, really the only update is now there is a lot of language in these rules specifically on processes and controls on allergen management and the prevention of cross-contact or inadvertent contact between an allergen and a non-allergen. So those were not in the GMPs previously. They are now. On to the animal food side of GMPs. Again, you'll see the section titles are very similar. Much of the content of the sections are similar, but again, different enough to where it warrants, you know, a review for sure. You have the personnel section. Notice you don't have disease control there. You just have a cleanliness discussion. Exterior of the facility, plant design, construction, etc. Sanitary operations. Obviously, in the animal part of the GMPs, you do not have allergen management control discussions. There is no cross-contact potential. There is no legislation on allergen management for the animal feed industry. So therefore, the GMPs do not contain any language on allergen management or prevention of cross-contact in the GMPs for animal food. Water supply and plumbing, equipment and design, plant operations, holding and distribution, and instead of defect action levels, which we saw on the human food side, we have the storage conditions for human food byproducts. Which basically talk about the protection of those byproducts and proper labeling, etc., so that you don't contribute to contamination. So, you know, the animal feed industry is really being, you know, kind of brought up to not quite the level of the human food industry, but certainly a significant step towards that and in that direction. So again, if you look at the preamble, that information prior to the issuance of the rule, some of the things that's important to understand why FDA has taken this action that they have, and specifically why they're going down the road of what we call the preventive control rule, which is what we're going to be focusing the rest of our discussion on. And in their past discussions or their past legislation activity, things like HACCP. So as we know, just a quick background looking backwards, FDA has issued 2 previous food safety rules, one for the seafood industry in the late 90s, mid-90s, HACCP for the seafood industry. And in the early 2000s, we had HACCP for the fruit juice industry. So, you know, FDA has gone down the road of issuing HACCP rules for various industry segments in the past. And what they did now is they've kind of gone beyond that and said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to now look at preventive controls for the rest of the industry and the entire food industry that's under our jurisdiction. And you know, to understand why, it's important to understand, you know, some of their thought process. So if you look at the preamble, basically what it says is that FDA indicated they feel that contributing factors to the production and distribution of contaminated foods are the fact that a company does not really understand in 60% of the time the hazards that they have to address and the food safety hazards that they have to deal with in their processes. And as you say, 60% there of all problems come from ingredient suppliers. And I know from my experiences many times in dealing with a customer of ours who has had a recall, it's basically because, you know, someone sent them product that was contaminated. They processed it and moved it on to their customers, and now, you know, their supplier let them know they have a recall, and now they have to tell, you know, their customers they have a recall. So, you know, flowing it through that contamination through the supply chain. And the supply chain management is going to be an important part of this rule, which we'll talk about in just a little bit later on. Secondly, lack of training. And I think, you know, FDA takes a pretty strong stance here on, you know, understanding, you know, the hazards, the need for training, the need for food safety training, and they actually write it into the rule as a requirement, which is certainly different than what we had previously. And then lastly, you know, why not HACCP? Why have they gone to the preventive controls route? And again, you have to kind of look at the data that we have available to us today. You know, we know that allergens is the #1 cause of recalls and has been for the last 10 years or so here in the U.S. And if you look at, you know, HACCP plans, and if you look at HACCP training courses, you know, there are some food safety controls that just don't fit the HACCP model. Things like allergens, things like listeria in the environment, salmonella in the environment, employee hygiene practices. You know, some of those things just don't fit the HACCP model, and they're not usually, you know, critical control points. They're not addressed through a HACCP plan, and therefore FDA basically said, you know what, we can't just limit it to HACCP. We can't just say, well, we're only going to focus on, you know, things that a company decides as a CCP, and not deal with, you know, hazards that really are driving our recalls and illnesses. So they went the preventive control route, which basically, as we'll talk about, certainly goes above and beyond, you know, a HACCP requirement. So what is the preventive control requirement? Basically, it states that a facility must have a written food safety HACCP plan, so documented food safety HACCP plan. They have to conduct a hazard analysis, which is very similar to what we know from HACCP. They have to identify their hazards. When they do identify a hazard that is reasonably likely to occur, they must build a preventive control to deal with it. This can be, and we'll talk about them in just a minute, things like, you know, listeria monitoring, environmental monitoring, employee hygiene, cooking, metal detector, you know, all those types of controls. They have to monitor and have documented monitor procedures for those preventive controls. They have to have corrective actions and corrections for when issues occur, verification, validation. So if you know HACCP, as many of us I'm sure on the call do, you know, a lot of those monitoring, corrective actions, hazard analysis, verification, validation, those are all the HACCP principles that we all know so well. So basically what FDA has said is we're going to apply those HACCP principles to all controls, all hazards that have been identified, whether you label them as CCP or not, which is essentially what the rule states. The rule also has, as I mentioned, a requirement for supply chain, which we'll mention a little bit later on. If you have to have a hazard analysis and identify any hazards that need to be controlled, you must have a recall plan. And then, of course, you must keep records of all of these activities. So those, in a nutshell, or a brief summary, are the specific requirements or other requirements of the preventive control rule. And then we'll kind of break into each of those over the next 20 minutes or so. So again, the hazard analysis is you must perform a hazard analysis to determine, is there a hazard that is reasonably likely to occur in your facility? Now these are, you know, as we are familiar with, the biological, chemical, and physical hazards. Now there was at some early on in this process, FDA had talked about introducing a new hazard category, radiological. I think comments showed them the better part of valor there, and they decided to classify radiological hazards under chemical. So we're back to our traditional 3 hazard types of biological, chemical, and physical, which is what we get from HACCP. But basically, when you do identify a hazard that must be addressed that's reasonably likely to occur, a preventive control must be built for that hazard. So examples include as I mentioned, our traditional CCPs that we're comfortable with, our traditional critical control points that we're familiar with, things like cooking, things like cooling, things like metal detector, things like pH control, all those traditional critical control points that we're familiar with, those will now be process controls. In addition, things like allergen management, again, not for the animal food side of the world, but for the human food side for sure. Listeria in the environment, salmonella in the environment, employee hygiene practices, supplier monitoring, what could be a preventive control. All of these types of activities now that we have kind of called, prerequisite programs and dealt with them that way in previous HACCP programs are now really going to be looked at as a preventive control. Sanitation, again, supply chain, approved suppliers, products coming in with a certificate of analysis, that could be a preventive control as well. And then, of course, you must have a recall plan to have that in place in the event that, an issue occurs. So how do we manage our preventive controls? Well, you'll find it's very similar to the way that we're asked to manage our critical control points now. We must have written procedures for all of our preventive controls. We must have documented monitoring procedures with frequency for monitoring defined. Who's going to do it? When are they going to do it? How are they going to do it? We must have documented corrective actions and corrections. So again, FDA does make the distinction there between a correction, which is the short-term fix, and a corrective action, which is more of the long-term preventive action type activity. They talk about verification, and they use the words verification and validation a lot in the rule, so we need to understand exactly what it is that they're looking for. Validation, again, by a preventive control qualified individual. So we're going to talk more about that term and what that person does, but that's a new term that FDA has introduced with this rule. So that's going to be an important topic of discussion going forward. A preventive controlled qualified individual must perform validation of the preventive controls. That preventive control qualified individual must do record review of all activities within 7 days of their occurrence. We must do calibration of equipment, which is a verification activity. That would be things like calibrating thermometers and metal detectors and scales and pH meters and et cetera, et cetera. FDA specifically mentions testing as a verification activity as well, both product testing, finished product testing, raw material testing, as well as environmental monitoring. We'll talk more about that in just one second, but they specifically give some examples of where they would expect that a facility would utilize, say, environmental monitoring as a verification activity for preventive control, meaning we know that the preventive control is under control and that risk and that hazard is under control, specifically in things like ready-to-eat foods of risk of environmental contamination. FDA is going to expect to see environmental monitoring. And then, of course, we must keep records of all activities, so records of the monitoring, records of the corrective action, and we'll review that again here in just a minute. So again, because they use the language so much in the rule, I wanted to take just a few minutes, or a few seconds actually, and just go over the verification and validation. What's the difference? This is the language right out of the rule that the FDA uses on defining verification versus validation. So the first bullet is their definition, and the second bullet is mine because I'm a little simpler than they are. But verification is essentially activities to ensure that a control measure has been operating as intended. Okay, so basically, are you doing what you say you're doing? So these are the activities to ensure that a control measure is operating as intended. So you're doing what you say you're doing. Validation is basically activities, scientific, technical combinations of, etc., that ensure that the preventive control is capable of effectively controlling the identified hazard, or does it work? And those are terms that we're familiar with in HACCP, and those are basically the same definitions that we use for them in HACCP, but I just wanted to take a minute because sometimes we get confused between verification and validation, and what do we mean there. So verification is much more of an ongoing activity, which really never stops. A validation is more of a one-time type of activity that once we prove a preventive control works, unless that preventive control changes, we don't have to continue to prove that it works. We just have to continue to prove that we're actually following what we said we're going to do, and those are the verification activities. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about that. On to product testing. So, FDA makes a point of specifically saying, they expect that a facility will consider employing testing as a verification activity. And if you look to the, the beginning of the rule, the preamble, is testing required? That's a very common question that I've managed over the last 12 months or so. And if you look at the guidance from FDA, basically what they say in the preamble is it's really dependent on the facility, the food, and the nature of the preventive control. So that's the criteria we have to go on. That's what FDA is giving us as guidance. So really, according to them, it's up to the facility to decide if they want to employ raw material testing or finished product testing. But in certain cases, they will expect to see it. Now, what are those cases? We don't know. I think it's going to be, unfortunately, an inspector by inspector type interpretation. But certainly at Eurofins, we can help, you kind of navigate that to determine if we believe FDA would expect to see testing on certain types of products or in certain types of facilities. When it is required, when you do decide that you're going to do it, there are some specific elements that need to be included in that. It needs to be scientifically valid. What that means is the sampling plan needs to have some validity behind it rather than just say a 1 gram sample or a 5 gram sample or a 10 gram sample of a product. The sampling plan needs to have some scientific validity behind it. You must identify the test organism that you're interested in, your target. You must set the procedures for how you do your sampling. Again, it needs to be scientifically valid. The frequency of sampling, how often are you going to do this testing? Is it once a month? Is it once a week? Is it once a lot? Is it once a day? The test to be conducted, is it going to be a coliform test? Is it going to be a quantitative, qualitative, etc.? The laboratory conducting the testing, FDA in their preamble talked quite a bit about the use of a laboratory. If it's outside of your facility, they want that laboratory to be ISO 17025 accredited, etc. So they want the laboratory to be identified within the testing procedure. And then, of course, if you do find results that are not within your target, what are you going to do about it? So included in your testing protocol is what are your corrective actions. If you do exceed your limit, if you do exceed the obtaining a result that is undesirable, what are you going to do about it? So they want that directly right into the procedure. On to environmental monitoring. Again, the question is testing required? Let's look to that preamble again for guidance. Basically what the FDA says is that if a facility, a little bit more specific here, if the facility produces a ready-to-eat food and the ready-to-eat food is exposed to the environment and there is a risk of environmental contamination, they will expect that there is some level of environmental monitoring activity that occurs. Now again, they're not saying how much you have to do. They're not saying what kind of tests you have to do. They're not saying how often you have to do it. That's your call. But they expect it to be, as they say there in the first bullet, scientifically valid. They expect, similar to the product testing side, identify the test microorganisms, specify the locations to be sampled and the number of samples to be taken, timing and frequency for your sampling. Again, what test are you going to be running? Which laboratory is going to be doing the testing for you? And include corrective action, again, if you do find negative results or positive results, depending on your perspective, I guess, targets that are not met, what are you going to do about it? What are your corrective actions as defined? So that's what, the guidance that we have on is testing required, and that was one of the big questions coming into the final rule was FDA going to require product testing and require environmental testing? So after looking at the final rule, basically the best way we can answer that is it depends on what you make, it depends on how you make it, and it depends on the facility that you're in. But, in some cases that answer is going to be no, and in some cases that answer is going to be yes, it is required. On to training now. As I mentioned, FDA says training and knowledge of hazards is a big issue that needs to be addressed in the industry. Specifically, they describe it in the preventive control rule as saying that management must ensure that all individuals are qualified to perform their assigned duties. So they introduce another term here called a qualified individual. This is a person who has whatever necessary training or education or experience is necessary to perform their activity. So this is going to be people like in production, or in operations, or even in maintenance, or even in the warehouse, shipping, receiving, etc. Do these folks have the necessary information, knowledge, training to be able to perform their duties as assigned? And more importantly, what the rule says is everyone basically within the facility must have some level of food safety and food hygiene training. Now, it doesn't say how often. It's basically going to leave it to the facility to decide how often is refresher training necessary. It says they'll expect to see refresher training, but it doesn't say, for example, that it has to be every year or anything like that. But they do say that they expect it to occur basically when the employees, start with the facility. So all, employees, food safety training as well as food hygiene training. And then, of course, we must keep records of that training, those training activities as well. Now, on to the preventive controls qualified individual. Again, this is a separate designation from the qualified individual. This is a new term they introduced here in the final rule to distinguish it from the qualified individual. So this is where a person must attend a preventive control training class that's FDA recognized, or be qualified through job experience to be able to have the necessary skills and knowledge. Who makes that call if you have to go to preventive control training course, or if you're qualified through your job experience? Basically the facility does, but obviously the FDA is going to have to agree or disagree with that decision. So, the preventive control training courses are going to be coming soon to the industry. They're not out there yet. They're basically coming from the Preventive Control Alliance. Eurofins will be offering those, as I'm sure many other folks will, but we have not seen the final curriculum for those as of yet. So what are these preventive control qualified individuals, what are they going to be asked to do? Well, that's specifically spelled out in the rule. A preventive controls qualified individual must do or oversee the following activities. So this must be the individual who prepares the food safety plan. This is the person who originally conducts the hazard analysis, runs through the preventive controls, develops the monitoring procedures, et cetera, the verification activities, the validation activities, et cetera. They're the person who validates the preventive controls to ensure that they're working. So again, as designed, they would be effective. That's more of a one-time type thing. You don't have to continue to do that. There is a person who would determine if you don't have to have validation. Here's why you don't have to have it. So that would have to be a preventive controls qualified individual. They are required to be the one who reviews your records within 7 days of activity. So that means basically every week, all of your activities for that last 7 days of activity must be reviewed by a preventive control qualified individual. So that could be calibration records, that could be monitoring records, that could be corrective action records, that could be test records, that could be operations records, that could be temperature records, that could be all different types of records. Anything that you've produced over the last week, within 7 days of their creation, a preventive control qualified individual must review them and sign off on them. And finally, the individual must analyze the food safety plan at least every 3 years. So we're familiar with at least an annual review of food safety plans. FDA has put that requirement for everyone of at least every 3 years. Now, important to note here that the qualified individual does not have to be an employee of the facility. It can be a consultant, or it can be just an individual that the facility utilizes to perform these roles. But it does have to be someone who meets their definition of what is a preventive control qualified individual. So that basically means all facilities, all manufacturing facilities, distribution centers, et cetera, are going to have access to a preventive controls qualified individual to be able to at least perform the record review at least once a week. So speaking of records, what records will need to be reviewed, what records are required to be maintained for the rule. I've mentioned these a bit already, but to have them all in one spot. Monitoring of the preventive controls, corrective action taken. Again, those verification activities, the initial validation of the preventive controls to prove they work. The verification of your monitoring records, so a review of monitoring records. Verification that your corrective actions are effective. Any calibration records, so again, thermometers, scales, metal detectors, pH meters, et cetera, et cetera. Your product testing records, your environmental monitoring records. A record that you've actually done the record review has to be kept. The reanalysis of the food safety plan at least every 3 years must be maintained. Records that document your supply chain program, which we're going to talk about next. Records that document the training that we reviewed as far as for the qualified individuals, the food safety and the food hygiene training. Records that document training of the preventive control qualified individual. So the person who you have designated as the person who's going to be responsible for your food safety plan, responsible for reviewing your records, you have to have records that show why they are your preventive controls qualified individual. Mention a term there, qualified auditor. We're going to get to that when we go to supply chain program. But essentially, based on risk, many of your suppliers are going to have an on-site audit. And the term used by the FDA is a qualified auditor. So, we have to have records of those qualified auditors as well, specifically when that auditor is an employee of your facility. Many people may choose to use third-party audits to satisfy that role, and that's acceptable. But we'll just need, of course, records for their training as well. And then lastly, any record justifying why you feel you don't need to meet any part of the rule. So if there's a risk analysis or a risk assessment that you're going to do to say this is why we don't have to do validation, this is why we don't have to do verification, this is why we don't have to do product testing, this is why we don't have to do environmental monitoring, you must have a record of that justification. Why do we think we don't, this doesn't apply to us? We don't need to do on-site audits. We don't need to do environmental monitoring. We don't need to do product testing, et cetera. We need to have a documented record of that justification. So as far as the records themselves, as far as records management, they must be kept as, can be kept as hard copy or electronic, must be accurate and legible, created at the time of the performance of the activity. So that means we can't, take records and then fill them in, at the end of the day or at the end of the week. We have to do them at the time that the activity occurred. Has the facility identity included on them, date and time of the activity, signature or initials of the individual performing the activity or the monitor, identify the product or the lot, and must be retrievable within 24 hours. So you don't have to keep them on site for the 2 years that they have to be retained, but you do have to be able to obtain them, retrieve them within 24 hours. Your food safety plan must be signed and dated by a member of senior management upon completion and upon any changes to the food safety plan. And again, as we know, it must be signed and dated at least every 3 years. So it must be initially signed and dated, and then, at least within that 3-year reanalysis requirement. And again, as we see there at the bottom, records must be maintained for 2 years. So all records, whether you're fresh, frozen, all records must be maintained for at least 2 years per the requirement. Now this is mainly for distribution centers, storage of unpackaged food. So there's a distinction between if a facility covers food that is exposed to the environment or food that is not exposed to the environment. So say, for example, a produce warehouse where they have open boxes of leafy greens that have slits in the sides. Those would be exposed to the environment, and therefore that facility must be in compliance with the entire rule of preventive controls. If a facility happens to only handle boxed goods or unexposed product that does not have exposure to the environment, then all they have to have is basically they don't have to do preventive controls. They do have to do the GMPs. They don't have to do preventive controls, and they really just have to monitor temperature. So they have to establish their temperature controls. They have to monitor temperature. They have to take corrective action if the temperature is out of control, and then verify that their temperature controls are effective and review their records within 7 days. And of course, keep records of those. So basically, temperature is their only preventive control they have to worry about. So therefore, none of the rest of the preventive control rule applies to those facilities. So this would be someone like a frozen warehouse, frozen distribution center that only handles frozen goods. All the frozen goods are completely enclosed, sealed inside of a cardboard box, inside of, plastic film inside that box. It's completely sealed. Those facilities would not need to go through the whole preventive control. All they have to have is temperature controls in place and GMPs, and they're in compliance. Now, lastly, the supply chain program, that is a important component of the rule as well. So the facilities must have a documented approved supplier program in place. So how are those suppliers going to be approved? How are their food safety plans assessed, et cetera? Supplier verification program must be part of the supply chain program. Again, that must be documented. Verification activities of the suppliers' activities. Again, it's risk-based, so you have to decide which suppliers are at highest risk of having, providing you contaminated product or at-risk product. But on-site audits is part of that activity. So, either you or a third-party agent, third-party auditor, et cetera, must go out and do, for high-risk suppliers, on-site audits to verify their performance. You could also do verification activities through product testing, product sampling of raw materials. Again, a review of their supplier food safety records, which generally would occur during an on-site audit. Those are all examples of verification activities that the agency is expecting that you would be taking of your suppliers. Again, they're concerned about product coming in that's contaminated, which is a leading cause of recalls, and therefore they're wanting the facility to get a bit more proactive in the management of their supply chain. You need to have receiving procedures in place for your raw materials, and of course you need to keep records of all of these activities as well. So as we talk about, how often is the inspection going to happen? How often is FDA going to be around? We know in some agency or some segments of the industry, we don't see them very often at all. Some we see them quite a bit more often. But when the agency is going to be assigning risk, they're going to have a few things which they're going to take into consideration. Do your type of products or your industry have a history of foodborne illness? Have you had a recall, or has there been many recalls in your industry? And lastly, do you have robust food safety programs? Now the question is going to be, how are they going to know that? Well, we don't exactly know yet. We think we're going to find out a bit more when the third-party certification rule comes out. But what we hope is that the agency will take into consideration those facilities who, say, have a GFSI recognized certification and reduce their risk and reduce their inspection frequency, as opposed to those folks who don't. So perhaps if you've got two facilities next door to each other, one has an SQF certificate, one does not. The one with the SQF certificate might be inspected once every 3, 4, 5 years. The one without the SQF facility, depending on what they make, may be inspected once every 1 or 2 years. So what we hope is that the agency takes into account, demonstration of the robustness of their food safety program. They say they're going to, but they just haven't said how they're going to do that yet. So we expect certification will play a role in that. So some of the release dates for the Food Safety Modernization Act, as we see, the Preventive Control Rule was released September 10th. Some of the upcoming ones, a big activity expected at the end of October when we see the produce rule. We see the foreign supplier verification program. So again, this is if you bring in product from overseas and you know that product is imported and delivered to you, this rule is going to apply to you. And then of course the third-party certification rule. Again, how is the agency going to use third-party certification, and those auditors? Hopefully we'll see the final requirements there for that. So that's the end of October. The food transportation, sanitary transportation rules, the end of March, and then the food defense intentional adulteration rule, the end of May 2016. So again, the next 6 to 8 months are going to be where we'll see the rest of the FSMA final rules. So more importantly, probably what many of you folks are asking now is, when does this come to me? When do I have to be worried about it? For very small businesses, you have 3 years of compliance, and again, those dates are from September of 2015. So what's a very small business? In the human food world, that is less than $1 million in sales, annual sales. On the animal food side, that's less than $2.5 million in sales. So that means that for those very small businesses, you have 3 years to comply. So that will be September of 2018. For businesses who are subject to the pasteurized milk ordinance, you have 3 years to comply. So that will be September of 2018. For small businesses with less than 500 full-time equivalent employees, you have 2 years to comply, which will be obviously September of 2017. And for everyone else, that's 1 year for compliance, or September of 2016. Now, it should be noted also that the animal food facilities will get an additional year to implement preventive control. So, for example, if you are a very small animal food manufacturer, you get 3 years to implement the GMPs, so that's September of 2018, and then you get an additional year to implement the preventive control portion of the rule, which would be September of 2019. So anywhere from 3 to 4 years on the animal food side. So those are the compliance dates, and that's when the rule essentially will be coming to you. You know, at Eurofins, we like to think that we have got solutions for all of the industry on FSMA requirements. Certainly we have, you know, product testing and environmental monitoring solutions that we can provide. We have supplier verification audits, which we can do. Training on the preventive controls, as well as HACCP course. We're excited to announce that we've got a FSMA forum on November 9th of leading industry agents, both from Iowa State, AFIA, industry, etc. We're going to be coming into Des Moines and talking about, you know, what does FSMA mean to you and how can you comply, and then we provide consulting activities as well. You know, Eurofins is set up to be a full service solution provider on all things for the food industry, both from chemistry, microbiology, certification, training, etc. You know, we have food safety solutions on, you know, providing for training, for public training, on-site training, consulting activities, certainly a full scope of audits that we can perform globally. GFSI recognized schemes, SQF, BRC, FSSC 22000, second party audits, etc., etc. And lastly there, we have a full complement of food safety training courses that are available this fall and winter if you are interested, including our new Good Laboratory Practice for Food Plants in Des Moines there in the middle of November. So we certainly encourage you to come to eurofinsus.com and learn more about many of the different types of solutions that we can provide for you to try to make this compliance with FSMA go smoothly for you. So with that, I'll leave my contact details there on the screen and turn it back over to Karen. Again, I certainly appreciate everyone's time and attention, and you know, it is certainly a exciting time, I guess, or an interesting time in the food industry, and you know, realize hopefully that Eurofins is here to help you manage these compliance activities that will be coming over the next few years.
Thank you, Gary. This was a very informative webinar, and we do have a bunch of questions, so I'll start asking you now, and for everyone listening, any questions that don't get answered during the webinar will be answered following the webinar by Gary through email communication with you personally. So the first question today is, what would the validation taken place by a qualified individual look like?
Well, it depends really on what the preventive control is, what type of validation activities would need to be taken. The validation could be the environmental monitoring. Sanitation could be our preventive control, and the absence of listeria from our environment could be a validation activity, and we've done that. Maybe we do that once a year to prove that listeria is not in the facility. Validation could be the monitoring employees washing their hands coming out of the bathroom once a month to ensure that our employee hygiene practices are where they need to be. It's really just activities that you do, and you kind of have to get imaginative a little bit, use your imagination on whatever the intent of your preventive control is trying to do. How do you show that it works? How do you show that it's working? How do you show that if it's followed as you've written it, as you built it, how do you show that that works?
Thank you. The next question is, because there can be differences amongst FDA inspectors as to how they will score your facility food safety program, if you disagree with their findings, is there an opportunity to appeal their inspection results?
Not that I'm aware of. That's a great question. Can you appeal? Like certainly we have in the certification body world when we're doing a certification audit, et cetera, we have a means by which we handle disputes and appeals. As far as I'm aware, there is not. So basically, if an inspector says, well, you need to be environmental monitoring and you're not, or you need to be product testing and you're not, or you need to be doing this and you're not, I'm not aware of any of those appeals processes. I certainly do know that, as you move up the chain, and it's, many of these FDA inspections are going to be done by state agricultural inspectors. And I do know that, when I did FDA inspections back many, many, many years ago, I was working for the state of Missouri Department of Health, and if a facility had any issue or question, et cetera, they would go to the FDA field office. So potentially, those FDA field offices will probably be a place where a facility can appeal if they don't agree with a 483 that has been issued by an inspector. But I don't believe there is really a documented formal appeal process by which the facilities can utilize today.
Okay, thank you. The next question is A2LA accreditation okay under the new rules for outside testing, or only ISO 71025?
Yeah, A2LA is essentially a supplement or a parallel system to 17025. A2LA is the organization that manages the laboratory accreditation. So absolutely, A2LA is synonymous a bit with 17025. So those A2LA activities would be recognized by FDA for those contract laboratories.
Okay. The next question is, so would receiving logs also need to have times received?
Receiving records certainly are going to need to have the date and time of receipt of the activity. As we saw, the date and time of the activity must be included on records, so I would think receiving records would have that same requirement, yes.
Okay. The next question is, if we already have a robust HACCP program that includes all of the regulations but are listed as prerequisite programs, do we have to go through all of those and list them as preventative controls?
Well, you don't have to list them as preventive controls, but the key is that you have to have a documented, those prerequisite programs that we refer to them as now. You have to have all of those elements of those preventive controls documented. So the prerequisite programs must have, the monitoring documented, the program must be documented. Now, many of our prerequisite programs already do have all those things documented. If that's the case, then you are in compliance. But we can't say just because we have a HACCP program, we don't have to worry about FSMA, because that's not the case. FSMA does go above and beyond what we designate as the CCP. many of those prerequisite programs that we, say are control points or they're control programs, and this is why we don't have CCPs. That is what FDA is going to be looking at to ensure that those are all documented, monitored, corrective actions taken when issues are shown, and verification activities occur. So, many of those prerequisite programs are documented to that level, but many of them are not as well. So that's going to be the key. What you call them is really not relevant. You're going to have the documentation of all the elements that are required for the rule.
Okay. We have 2 more questions that we'll answer online, and the rest of them will be answered after the webinar. The next question is that mean the rules won't be enforced until the deadline dates?
That is correct. Yeah, the compliance dates, that's when the inspectors, can come and expect that you will be in compliance with the rule on those compliance dates, obviously starting in September of 2016. Now, I certainly will encourage everyone to not wait until the last minute to think about how are we going to meet the requirements under the Food Safety Modernization Act. I would certainly, encourage everyone to be proactive and, look to see how can we build those systems and take our training and do all that well before our, deadline for our compliance dates.
Okay, and the last question is, if we are a raw material distributor and we open a box to keep a small retained sample for our facility, do we need to follow the new rule? We import raw materials and distribute only.
If you are exposing the product to the environment, the full preventive control rule will apply. If product is not exposed to the environment, you still have to do the GMPs, but you only have to do temperature control. So if you're exposing the product to take samples or retain samples or repack or anything like that, then as far as my interpretation would be, the entire elements of the preventive control rules would apply. Now, you may have, your preventive controls may be temperature control, and that's really all you do, but you also may have, because you've got, product open to the environment in those sampling areas, sanitation control concerns in those areas, as well as employee hygiene. So your preventive controls, if you're opening product to take samples, may include temperature, which it would anyway, but it may also include sanitation, maybe even pest control if you got exposed product, and employee hygiene as preventive control programs as well, since the product is exposed during the sampling.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Those are all the questions that we'll have answered during our webinar today. The rest of them will be answered through emails after the webinar is over. Again, thank you for joining us today for this webinar about FSMA. We welcome you at our November 9th FSMA Forum. Information on how to register for that event will be in the follow-up email that everyone will receive in the next day or so. Thank you again, and have a great day, everyone.